It was one of those freezing winter nights when the wind cuts through every layer of clothing, and the streets look empty long before midnight. The snow had been falling since noon, and by the time the lights in most shops turned off, only a few cars rolled by, their tires crunching on the icy road. Inside a small family restaurant at the corner of Maple Street, the warm light and smell of soup made it feel like another world compared to the bitter cold outside. The restaurant, the Cozy Plate, was owned by a man named David Lynn, who had been running it for almost 10 years. He had built it with his own hands after years of working odd jobs, saving every dollar he could. That night, David was wiping down tables, preparing to close. The clock above the counter showed 10:45 p.m. The last customer had left half an hour ago, and now it was just him and the quiet hum of the heater. He moved slowly, tired from another long day. December was always hard, sales dropped, bills piled up, and snowstorms often kept people home. As he walked toward the front door to flip the sign from open to closed, he noticed something unusual through the fogged-up glass. A faint shadow stood near the entrance, almost hidden under the awning. At first he thought it was just someone waiting for a bus. But the bus stop was 2 blocks away. David stepped closer, peering through the glass. There, pressed against the window, was an elderly woman wrapped in a worn-out coat that looked too thin for the weather. Beside her, a small girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, was sitting on a suitcase, her legs pulled to her chest. Both looked exhausted. The woman's face was red from the cold, her hands shaking as she rubbed them together. The little girl's cheeks were wet with tears, though she wasn't crying out loud anymore. David hesitated for a moment. He wasn't a man who liked to get too involved in strangers' lives. He had his own worries, rent, suppliers, and an aching loneliness that came from working too much and sleeping too little. But something about the scene tugged at him. He turned the door handle and opened it just a crack. "Excuse me," he called softly. "Are you all right out there?" The woman looked up quickly, startled. Her lips trembled before she answered, her voice almost lost in the wind. "I'm sorry, sir. We're fine. We'll move along soon. Just needed a place out of the wind for a bit." David frowned. "It's below freezing tonight. You can't stay out there." She shook her head quickly. "We don't want any trouble. We'll be gone soon." The little girl looked up at him, her eyes big and tired. She didn't say a word, but she held her grandmother's hand tighter. David felt something stir inside him. Something that reminded him of the nights his own mother had worked late and he'd waited for her by the stove, hoping she'd bring something warm to eat. "Come in," he said finally, opening the door wider. "Just for a bit." "It's warm inside." The woman hesitated, then nodded. She gently guided the little girl inside. The warmth hit them like a wave, and for a second, both just stood there, taking it in. Snowflakes melted on their clothes and turned to water, dripping onto the floor. David quickly grabbed a towel and handed it over. "Here, dry off." "Thank you," the woman said softly, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry for the mess." "It's fine," he said. "You both look frozen. Sit down, please." He guided them to a booth near the heater. The little girl climbed onto the seat, still clutching her small backpack. David walked behind the counter and filled 2 mugs with hot chocolate, the same kind he used to make for his niece when she visited. He brought them over and set them down. The little girl looked at the mug like it was something precious. "Thank you," she whispered before taking a small sip. The warmth seemed to bring color back to her face. "What's your name?" David asked gently. "I'm Lily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's a nice name," he said with a small smile. "And you?" he asked, turning to the woman. "Martha," she replied. "This is my granddaughter," David nodded. "I'm David. You're welcome to stay until the snow slows down. It's bad out there tonight." Martha smiled faintly, though her eyes looked tired and sad. "We really appreciate it. We've just had a rough few days. I didn't expect the storm to get this bad." David didn't ask more questions, though curiosity pulled at him. He could tell there was more to their story, there always was, but right now all that mattered was that they were safe. He went back to the kitchen and warmed up some soup. He poured it into 2 bowls, added a few slices of bread, and carried it out to them. "You didn't have to do this," Martha said softly when she saw the food. "I know," David replied, "but I want to." The smell of the soup filled the air, and soon the little girl was eating slowly, carefully, as if she didn't want to waste a single drop. David sat across from them for a moment, just watching. There was something peaceful about it, Something he hadn't felt in a while, like maybe kindness could still make a difference. Even on nights like this, when they finished eating, David cleared the dishes and told them they could stay until morning. "The buses won't run till the roads are cleared anyway," he said. Martha looked shocked. "You mean stay here overnight?" He nodded. "There's a small couch in the back room. It's not much, but it's warm. I'll lock up the front and you'll be safe there." For a moment she looked like she might cry. "You're too kind, sir. We'll be out of your way by morning, I promise." "It's fine," David said. "Get some rest." He showed them to the small storage room behind the kitchen, where there was an old sofa and some folded blankets he kept for emergencies. Martha thanked him over and over again while helping Lily lie down. The little girl fell asleep almost instantly, her small hands tucked under her cheek. David stood there quietly for a moment, watching them. The light above the sink cast a soft glow on their faces. Martha looked older than she probably was, her hair mostly gray, her hands rough and thin. But there was something gentle about her, something strong, too. "Good night," he said softly. "Good night, Mr. Lin," she replied. "Thank you for not turning us away." David smiled faintly and turned off the light. As he walked back to the front of the restaurant, he felt a heaviness in his chest that he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was guilt for having so much while others had so little. Or maybe it was gratitude for being reminded of what really mattered. He locked the doors, checked the windows, and sat down at one of the tables. The snow was still falling outside, covering everything in white. The streetlights glowed softly and the world felt quiet, almost peaceful. He thought about how many times he had walked past people asking for help and told himself he couldn't do anything. But tonight he had done something small, just offered warmth and food. And somehow that small thing didn't feel small at all. As the hours passed, the heater hummed steadily. David stayed awake longer than he meant to, thinking about the woman and child sleeping in the back. Who were they? What had happened to them? He wondered where they would go tomorrow, what their lives had been like before the cold took over. When he finally dozed off in the booth, the first light of dawn was peeking through the windows. The storm had stopped. The snow outside looked clean and untouched, like a new beginning. David stood up slowly, stretching his sore back, and walked to the back room. He peeked inside quietly. Martha was awake, sitting on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded. She smiled when she saw him. "Good morning," she whispered. "We'll get out of your way soon. I'll clean up before we go." David shook his head. "No rush, the roads are still icy. Let the girl rest a bit more." Martha's eyes softened. "You're a good man, Mr. Lin. We've met many people lately who wouldn't even look at us. I didn't expect this kindness." David didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being called kind. He'd always just tried to keep his head down and do what needed to be done. But hearing it now, it meant something. He smiled. "It's nothing. Just one night, but deep down, he didn't know that this one night was the start of something that would change all their lives forever." The sun had just started to rise when David brewed the first pot of coffee for the day. The smell filled the restaurant, blending with the scent of baked bread from the small oven. The world outside was still quiet, covered in a soft blanket of snow that sparkled under the morning light. He walked to the back room to check on Martha and Lily. The door was half open. Inside, Martha was folding the blanket neatly, while Lily sat on the couch rubbing her eyes awake. They both looked a little better than the night before, less pale, less tired, but their clothes still showed the harshness of their days. "Morning," David said gently. "How'd you sleep?" "Like a rock," Lily said with a sleepy smile. "It was so warm." Martha looked up, her eyes full of gratitude. "We can't thank you enough, Mr. Lin. You saved us from that storm." David shrugged a little. "Just glad you're both okay. You hungry? I'm making breakfast anyway." He walked back to the kitchen and started cooking. Some eggs, toast, and a bit of sausage. It wasn't fancy, but it smelled wonderful. When he brought it to their table, Lily's face lit up the way only a child's can when they see food they've been craving. She started eating right away, and even Martha couldn't hide her hunger for long. As they ate, David wiped the counter and tried not to stare, but he couldn't help wondering what their story was. He had seen homeless people before, sure, but rarely a grandmother and a little girl together. When the plates were empty, Martha stood and started gathering the dishes. "Oh no," David said. "You don't need to do that." Martha smiled faintly. "I can't just sit and do nothing. You've done more than enough." Before he could argue, she carried the dishes to the sink and began washing them like she'd worked there her whole life. Her hands moved quickly, even though they were rough and red from the cold. "You don't have to," he said again, but she only smiled. "Old habits. I used to run a small cafe once," she said quietly. "Feels strange to be near a kitchen and not help." David looked at her for a moment, surprised. "You ran a cafe?" She nodded. "Years ago, back when my husband was alive. We had a little place by the river. We made everything from scratch, bread, pies, soups. It wasn't big, but people came because they said it felt like home." There was a pause. Her eyes drifted for a moment like she was lost in a memory that hurt but was still dear to her. "What happened to it?" David asked softly, her voice lowered. "He got sick. The bills started piling up. I tried to keep the business running, but it was just too much. After he passed, I lost the cafe, then the house. I moved in with my daughter, but things got complicated. She couldn't take care of Lily anymore, and then, well, here we are." David didn't ask more. Some things were better left unsaid. He just nodded, feeling a heaviness in his chest. He looked at Lily, who was now drawing on a napkin with a small pencil she'd found. After breakfast, Martha and Lily gathered their things, a worn-out suitcase and a small backpack. David walked them to the door. "Where will you go now?" he asked. Martha smiled faintly. "We'll figure something out. Maybe the shelter downtown if there's room." "We'll be okay," he looked outside. The streets were still covered in ice, the cold wind blowing snow off the roofs. "At least let me drive you," he offered. But Martha shook her head. "You've done more than enough, Mr. Lynn. I don't want to be a burden." Before he could stop her, she picked up the suitcase. Lily waved shyly. "Thank you for the hot chocolate," she said. David smiled. "You're welcome, kiddo." He watched them walk away, the snow crunching under their shoes. The sight of their small figures disappearing down the road stayed with him all morning. The rest of the day passed slowly. Customers came and went, but David's mind kept drifting back to the grandmother and her granddaughter. He wondered if they'd found a place to stay, if they were warm, if they'd eaten again. Every time he looked at the empty booth where they'd sat, he felt a strange ache he couldn't quite name. That evening, the snow started again, soft, quiet flakes drifting through the yellow streetlights. David was closing up when he heard a gentle knock at the door. He turned, and his heart sank a little when he saw Martha standing there again, holding Lily's hand. They both looked soaked from the snow. "Martha," he said quickly, unlocking the door. "What happened?" She hesitated, embarrassed. "We went to the shelter, but they were full. They told us to try again tomorrow. We walked around a bit, but it got colder. I didn't know where else to go." David didn't think twice. "Come in," he said. "You can stay another night." She looked like she wanted to refuse, but exhaustion won. "Are you sure?" "Yes, no arguments this time," he said, half smiling. Lily ran in first, rubbing her cold hands together. David brought out 2 blankets and made them sit near the heater. He poured them some soup and let them eat in peace. As they ate, Martha looked around the restaurant again. "You run this place by yourself?" she asked. "For the most part," David said. "My nephew helps on weekends, but it's mostly me. Long hours, but it's honest work," she nodded. "It's a good place, feels kind." Her words warmed him more than the coffee he was drinking. He didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. Later that night, after they'd gone to sleep in the back room again, David sat by the counter thinking. He had always been proud of his independence, of never needing anyone. But suddenly he didn't like the quiet as much. The sound of Lily's soft breathing in the other room somehow made the restaurant feel alive again. The next morning, he found Martha already awake, wiping down tables before he even opened the doors. "You don't need to do that," he said. She smiled. "I know, but I can't just sit around. Let me earn my keep a little." He couldn't argue with her, and honestly, he didn't want to. She moved gracefully, cleaning with the same care he used to when he first opened the diner. It felt good to have someone else there, a kind of quiet company that didn't need words. When customers started coming in, Martha offered to help serve coffee. David tried to stop her at first, but she moved with such warmth and calm that even the regulars noticed. "New staff?" one of the customers joked. "Just helping out," Martha said with a smile that made everyone smile back. By noon, the restaurant felt busier than it had in weeks. Martha chatted softly with people, remembered small details about their orders, and made everyone feel welcome. David watched from behind the counter, amazed at how naturally she fit in. When the lunch rush finally slowed, he sat down across from her. "You were great with them," he said. "You really have a way with people," she chuckled. "Old habits die hard. I used to say food tastes better when it comes with kindness." David nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what I've been missing around here." The two shared a quiet moment before Lily came running up, holding one of the crayons she'd been using to draw. "Look, I made this," she said proudly, showing them a picture of the restaurant with 3 stick figures, him, Martha, and herself, smiling under a big yellow sun. David laughed softly. "You're quite the artist, Lily." Martha smiled at her granddaughter. "She loves to draw. Always has. Says she wants to make happy things so people won't feel sad." David looked at the drawing again. Something about it made him feel both happy and sad at the same time. He didn't know why, but he folded it carefully and set it behind the counter. As the day went on, it became clear that Martha and Lily weren't just passing through. They brought something to the diner that it had been missing for a long time. Warmth that wasn't just from the heater or the food. That night, after closing, David found Martha sweeping the floor. "You can stay as long as you need," he said quietly. She stopped, looking at him in surprise. "Are you sure? We don't want to take advantage." "No, it's not about that," he said. "You helped me today. You helped the restaurant. It felt good. It hasn't felt like that in a while." Martha's eyes softened. "Then thank you, truly, for everything," he nodded. "We'll figure things out as we go. For now, just rest." That night, as David turned off the lights, he glanced back at the booth where Lily had been coloring earlier. The crayon drawing still sat under the counter, the 3 figures smiling under the bright sun. He smiled to himself. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he was looking forward to it. The next few days passed quietly, but something in the restaurant had changed. The air felt warmer, the sound of laughter and clinking cups returned, and customers started staying longer than usual, chatting with Martha as if they'd known her for years. David noticed it right away. The place that had once felt lonely and heavy suddenly had life again. Every morning, Martha would arrive early to help him open. She'd sweep the floors, brew the first pot of coffee, and hum softly while wiping down tables. Lily would sit in the corner booth with her crayons, drawing pictures of people eating and smiling. One morning, as David was setting up the grill, he smelled something different. It wasn't his usual breakfast special. This was something richer, something that made his stomach growl before he even saw what it was. He turned to find Martha by the stove, a small apron tied around her waist, stirring a pot with slow, careful movements. "What's that?" he asked, wiping his hands on a towel. She smiled shyly. "Just an old recipe. Potato soup with herbs. My husband used to say it could warm even the coldest day." David chuckled. "Smells incredible. I don't even remember the last time the place smelled like that." "I found a few things in your pantry," she said. "I hope you don't mind." I thought it might be nice for lunch. He didn't mind at all. When lunchtime came, a few regulars walked in. Martha offered to serve them the soup instead of the usual menu, and they agreed, mostly out of curiosity. When they took the first bite, their faces said everything. "Now that's real cooking," one of them said, smiling. "Reminds me of my mother's kitchen." Word spread faster than David expected. The next day, more people came asking if there was any of that soup left. Then came her homemade bread, warm, soft, with a golden crust that filled the room with a smell no one could resist. David stood behind the counter watching as customers complimented her, some even asking for seconds. He hadn't seen his place this busy in months. Martha worked quietly, her face calm and focused, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. When they closed that night, David leaned against the counter, smiling. "You realize you might have just saved my restaurant, right?" She looked surprised. "Oh, I don't think it's me. People just needed something warm, something real." He laughed softly. "Well, whatever it is, they're loving it." "You've got a gift, Martha." She looked down, her smile gentle. It's been a long time since anyone said that. Over the next week, Martha began cooking more often. Each day she made something new. Chicken stew, fresh rolls, baked pies that melted in your mouth. David let her do it freely, even adding a small chalkboard by the door that read, "Today's special, Martha's Kitchen." People noticed. Within days, more customers started showing up. Families, workers from nearby shops, even the mailman who'd never stopped for more than a cup of coffee before. They came for her food, but they stayed because of how the place made them feel. There was something about Martha's way of speaking to people. She listened when they talked. She remembered small things, someone's favorite soup, another's bad back, a kid's birthday. It wasn't just food she served. It was care. Lily, too, had become a small part of the restaurant family. She'd draw pictures for the customers and sometimes hand them out as thank you cards. The walls behind the counter slowly filled with her colorful drawings, hearts, smiling faces, and one picture that said, "The cozy plate is my happy place." David couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled this much. He found himself looking forward to opening the doors each morning. The restaurant no longer felt like just a business. It felt alive, like a home. One rainy afternoon, while they were restocking supplies, David noticed Martha looking out the window, lost in thought. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Just thinking. It feels strange, you know, having people smile at me again. Being useful." "You never stopped being useful," he said. "Maybe life just took you on a longer road." She looked at him and smiled, a little misty-eyed. "You're kinder than you know, Mr. Lynn," David chuckled. "You can call me David by now." She laughed softly, shaking her head. Old habits. That evening, a small crowd stayed late at the restaurant, talking and laughing as rain tapped on the windows. One man stood up before leaving and said, "You should sell that bread of yours, Martha. I'd buy a loaf every day." After everyone left, David turned to her. "He's not wrong. You've got something special." "I just cook from the heart," she said. "That's all I know." "Sometimes that's exactly what people need," he replied. He meant it. The world outside felt colder and faster every year, but inside his small restaurant there was warmth that couldn't be faked. Over the next few weeks, things only got better. The diner, once barely surviving, began to thrive. They added a few new dishes, all from Martha's old recipes, and every one of them became a hit. David even created a small corner display for her pies and bread, and customers started placing orders to take home. One morning, he found a note taped to the door before opening. It read, "Best soup in town. Thank you for making this place feel like family." It wasn't signed, but it made both of them smile. Later that day, David noticed something unusual. A food critic from the local newspaper came in, notebook in hand. David's first reaction was worry. He'd never been reviewed before, and critics could be harsh. But Martha just smiled calmly and served the man her signature chicken stew with fresh bread. The critic didn't say much, just nodded quietly and took notes. When he left, David sighed. "Think he liked it?" Martha smiled. "If he didn't, at least he had a good meal." A few days later, the article came out. It read, "Hidden gem on Maple Street, a small diner that feeds more than just the stomach." The writer praised the food for its comfort and heart, calling it the kind of meal that feels like coming home after a long winter. By the next week, the restaurant was busier than ever. People came from nearby towns to try Martha's soup. The phone rang with catering requests and customers lined up before opening hours. David couldn't believe it. He'd spent years trying to keep the place alive, and now, thanks to one woman and her kindness, it was thriving like never before. That night, after closing, he sat with Martha and Lily at their usual booth. They shared a small cake Lily had made from leftover dough and frosting. "To new beginnings," David said, raising his coffee cup. Martha smiled. "To kindness that finds us when we least expect it." They clinked their cups together and laughed. For the first time in years, David didn't feel alone. He didn't think about bills or slow days or empty tables. He thought about how sometimes the smallest act, opening a door to a stranger on a cold night, could lead to something extraordinary. When they locked up and stepped outside, the street was quiet again, the moonlight bouncing off wet pavement. Martha held Lily's hand, and David walked beside them for a moment before saying goodnight. As he watched them walk down the road, he realized something deep inside him had changed. The restaurant was doing well, yes, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about connection. The kind that reminds you why you wake up every morning and keep trying, no matter how hard life gets. And somewhere deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could imagine. The weeks turned into months. and the restaurant was no longer just a small diner on a quiet street. It had become something special, a place where people came not only to eat but to feel at home. The regulars brought friends, new faces became familiar ones, and laughter filled the air every single day. Martha had become the heart of it all. Her food carried warmth, her presence carried peace. Customers often said there was something about her cooking that reminded them of better days, of their mothers and grandmothers who cooked with love instead of hurry. David noticed how people would walk in tired and walk out smiling. He noticed how Lily had grown more confident too. She greeted customers at the door, showed them her new drawings, and sometimes helped carry bread baskets. It felt like the world had shifted into something good. One quiet afternoon, after the lunch rush had ended, Martha was sitting at the corner table folding napkins. David poured 2 cups of tea and joined her. "You know," he said, "I never got to ask what made you start cooking in the first place." Martha smiled, her eyes soft with memory. "Oh, that goes way back. My mother taught me. She said food was more than just something to eat. It was a way to show love. We didn't have much growing up, but whenever we cooked, the house felt full. I think that's why I opened my cafe years ago." "I wanted other people to feel that too." David nodded. "Sounds like she raised you right." "She did," Martha said. "And my husband, he used to help me bake." We had a small cafe by the river. Every morning, the smell of bread would drift through the neighborhood. People said they could smell happiness coming from our kitchen. She laughed softly, but her voice trembled a little. "What happened after?" David asked gently. She looked down for a moment before speaking. "He got sick. The hospital bills were too much, and I couldn't keep the place running alone. I tried, but after he passed, everything fell apart. The cafe, the house, it all slipped away." David didn't say anything. He could feel the weight in her words. He had seen struggle before, but hers had the kind of quiet pain that time never completely washes away. Martha sighed. "After that, I went to live with my daughter. But life had been hard for her too. She had Lily, but her husband left and she couldn't handle everything. Then she lost her job and she left town. I haven't heard from her in a long time." Her voice broke slightly. "I didn't plan to end up on the streets. It just happened one day. And when you have a child depending on you, the world suddenly feels very heavy." David stared into his tea, speechless for a moment. "You shouldn't have had to go through that alone." Martha gave a small, tired smile. "No one plans for it, David, but you changed that night for us. You opened a door when everyone else turned away. I'll never forget that." He looked up at her and said quietly, "I think you did more for me than I did for you." She laughed softly. "How do you mean?" He smiled. "Before you came, this place was just a business. Now it feels like family. You brought life back into it. Into me too, if I'm being honest." Her eyes glistened and she looked down, hiding a smile. The days continued like that, peaceful, filled with small moments of joy. But one morning a letter arrived at the restaurant addressed to David. It was from the city council. Curious, he opened it and his face fell. It was a notice. The building owner was planning to sell the property. The rent would go up almost double in 2 months. That night, David sat at his usual table staring at the paper. The restaurant was doing well, but not well enough to handle that kind of increase. Martha walked over quietly, noticing his worry. "What's wrong?" she asked. He handed her the letter. "Looks like we might have to move or close down. I can't afford that rent." Martha read it carefully, her face calm but serious. "There must be something we can do," David sighed. "I'll figure something out. Maybe talk to the owner, see if he'll reconsider." But Martha shook her head. "You've worked too hard for this place. We'll figure it out together." He smiled faintly. "Together, huh?" "Yes," she said firmly. "This restaurant isn't just yours anymore. It's ours. Everyone who walks through those doors feels like part of it." The next few days she started talking to the regulars about what was happening, not to complain, but to explain. And something incredible began to happen. Customers started leaving tips larger than usual. A few offered to help organize a small community event to raise money. Someone even suggested holding a Martha's Night, a special dinner event where she would cook her best dishes, and all the earnings would go toward keeping the restaurant open. When David heard about it, he was shocked. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. Martha smiled. "I didn't, they wanted to. You gave them a place that feels like home." People remember that. The night of the event came fast. The restaurant was packed. More people than David had ever seen in there before. Every table was full and laughter echoed through the walls. Martha was in the kitchen, moving gracefully, her hands steady as she cooked. Lily helped serve plates with a big grin on her face. The food smelled amazing. Chicken stew, baked bread, apple pie, all made from her old recipes. People told stories, shared memories, and thanked David and Martha for everything they had done. At one point, David looked around the restaurant and felt something swell inside him. The same place that once felt too quiet was now alive with warmth and love. Later that night, after everyone left, he counted the earnings. It wasn't just enough to cover the rent. It was more than enough to help keep the restaurant secure for months. He looked at Martha, who was sitting at the table wiping her tired hands. "We did it," he said softly. "You did it," she shook her head. "We all did. Everyone who believes in this place. You see, David, people don't just come for food. They come for connection, for kindness. You gave them that." "You gave me that." David smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. "Maybe. But you reminded me why I started this in the first place." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. Lily was asleep in the corner booth, her head resting on her arms. After a few minutes, Martha spoke again. "You know, when I lost everything, I thought my story was over. But maybe it was just changing direction." David nodded. "Sometimes the hardest chapters lead to the best ones." She looked at him and smiled. "Maybe that's true." Over the following weeks, the restaurant continued to grow. The story of Martha's night spread through town and people kept coming, not just for the food, but because they wanted to be part of something good. A local paper even published a follow-up article about the restaurant's comeback. It talked about kindness, community, and second chances. They took a picture of David, Martha, and Lily standing in front of the restaurant, all smiling. David kept a copy of that photo behind the counter. Every time he looked at it, he felt thankful. Not just for the success, but for the people who had walked into his life when he least expected it. Martha, too, had changed. She walked with more confidence, her laughter more frequent. She still carried the memories of her past, but now they didn't weigh her down. They guided her. And Lily, bright and full of life, had started calling the restaurant her home. One evening, as the sun was setting, Martha stepped outside with David to lock up. The street was quiet, the sky painted in orange and pink. "Funny, isn't it?" she said softly. "How one small act of kindness can change everything." David nodded. "Yeah. I let you stay for one night, and it turned into the best decision of my life." Martha looked at him and smiled, her eyes shining. "You didn't just give us shelter, David. You gave us a reason to hope again." He looked back at her with the same warmth. "And you gave this place a soul." They stood there for a while, watching the last bit of sunlight fade, both quietly thankful for how life had brought them together. What began as a single act of kindness had grown into something far greater, a reminder that sometimes, when you open your door to someone in need, you might just be opening the door to your own second chance. The restaurant had now become a place people spoke about with warmth in their voices. What had started as a small diner at the corner of the street was now known all across the town as the place where kindness lived. It wasn't fancy, and it didn't have expensive decorations or flashy signs, but it had something better: heart. Every morning, David arrived early to open the doors, just as he always did. But now he wasn't alone. Martha would already be there, kneading dough or humming softly while she prepared the day's first batch of bread. The smell of her baking filled the air, drifting down the street and welcoming everyone who passed by. Lily would sit by the counter, coloring on napkins or practicing her reading. She had grown taller, her laughter brighter, and her eyes sparkled every time she ran up to greet customers. People had watched her grow in that restaurant, like a flower blooming in the middle of the city's noise. Life felt steady, full, and peaceful. One afternoon, as David was serving a table near the window, a man in a neat suit walked in. He looked around, clearly curious, and took a seat near the back. Martha brought him a menu, and he smiled politely. After a moment, he said, "I've heard a lot about this place. They say the food here has something special in it." Martha chuckled. "If it does, it's just love and a little bit of butter." The man laughed, but David noticed the notepad in his hand. When the meal ended, he asked if he could speak with the owner. David wiped his hands and walked over. "That would be me," he said. The man smiled and introduced himself as a local food critic from a well-known city magazine. "I was told I needed to visit this restaurant," he said. "I didn't believe the stories until now." David looked surprised. "Stories?" "Yes," the man said. "People told me about an older woman who came here during a snowstorm and changed everything. About how this place brings people together, and now that I've tasted the food, I understand why." Martha looked at him shyly. "I just cook what I know," she said. The man nodded. "And that's what makes it so beautiful." A week later, the magazine published an article titled, "The Little Restaurant That Feeds the Heart." The story spread quickly. Pictures of Martha smiling in the kitchen and Lily handing a plate to a customer filled the page. It wasn't about fame or fancy recognition. It was about kindness. The article said, "In a world that often feels rushed, this small restaurant reminds us what warmth tastes like." When David read it, he sat quietly for a while. Martha was washing dishes nearby when he handed her the magazine. She wiped her hands and looked at it, her eyes widening when she saw her own face on the page. "Oh my," she whispered. "That's me?" David laughed. "It sure is. You're famous now." She shook her head, smiling shyly. "I don't care about that. But I hope it helps bring more people here. The more we serve, the more we can give." And she was right. In the days that followed, more customers came than ever before. Some drove from neighboring towns just to try her stew or her fresh bread. But what touched David most was not the money they made. It was the way people treated each other. Strangers shared tables, laughter spread easily, and the restaurant became more like a family gathering than a business. One afternoon, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed to Martha. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a letter and a small photograph. Her eyes filled with tears as she read. David, seeing her expression, walked over. "Everything all right?" She nodded, then handed him the letter. It was from her daughter. She had found a stable job in another city and had been searching for Martha and Lily for months. She wrote that she had seen the magazine article and couldn't believe it was them. She wanted to visit, to make things right. Martha pressed the photo to her heart. It was of her daughter, smiling, holding a letter in her hand. "I prayed for this day," she whispered. David smiled softly. "Seems like prayers have a way of finding their way home." A few weeks later, her daughter arrived. The moment she stepped into the restaurant, she froze at the doorway, her eyes searching. Martha looked up from the counter, and for a second, everything went still. Then she rushed forward, arms open, tears streaming down her face. They held each other for a long time. No words, just quiet sobs and soft laughter. Lily ran to them, wrapping her small arms around both. It was a moment that made everyone in the restaurant stop and watch. Some smiled, some wiped their eyes. Later that night, after everyone left, Martha sat with David. "You gave me back my family," she said. He shook his head. "You gave yourself that. You brought light wherever you went," she smiled. "Still, I'll never forget what you did for us. You saw two strangers outside your door and decided to open it. That choice changed everything." David leaned back, thinking quietly. "Funny thing," he said. "I used to think running a restaurant was about food. Now I know it's about people." Over the months that followed, life continued to bless them in small, meaningful ways. Martha's daughter started working part-time at the restaurant, helping with deliveries and bookkeeping. Lily started school nearby but still came to the restaurant every afternoon, where she'd do her homework in her favorite booth. David noticed that the laughter never seemed to fade anymore. Even on quiet days, there was always joy in the air. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David stood outside the restaurant, looking up at the sign above the door. It still had the same old letters, "The Corner Diner," though a few were chipped and faded. He turned to Martha and said, "I've been thinking of changing the name." She looked at him curiously. "Oh, to what?" He smiled. "Martha's Table." Her eyes widened. "David, you can't do that. This is your place." He shook his head. "No, this is our place. You're the heart of it. People come here because of you, because you make them feel like they belong." She looked touched but hesitant. "That's too kind," he smiled warmly. "It's not kindness. It's truth." A month later, the new sign went up. Martha's Table. The whole town celebrated. People gathered outside cheering, taking photos, clapping as Martha shyly wiped away tears. From that day on, the restaurant wasn't just a place to eat. It was a symbol of second chances, of kindness, and of how one good deed can change the course of many lives. Years passed, but the story of that cold night never faded. New people came and went, but David always told them the same thing. It all started with one act of kindness. Whenever someone new asked why the restaurant felt so different, Martha would smile and say, "Because every meal here has a story behind it." And she was right. Every dish, every laugh, every smile that passed through those doors carried a piece of that story. A story of how a man who once only wanted to run a business ended up finding a family, and how a woman who had lost everything found home again. One quiet night, long after closing, David sat at a corner table with Martha and Lily. The restaurant was empty, the lights warm and soft. Outside, snow was falling, just like the night they had first met. He looked around and said, "Do you ever think about how different things could have been if I hadn't opened that door?" Martha smiled, looking at the snow. "I do, and I thank God you did." Lily giggled, sipping her hot chocolate. "Grandma says this place is magic," she said. David smiled. "It is, sweetheart. The best kind of magic, kindness." Martha reached across the table and gently placed her hand on his. "You gave us more than shelter, David. You gave us life again." He squeezed her hand back. "And you gave me a reason to keep believing in good people." Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, wrapping the world in quiet peace. Inside, the small restaurant glowed like a lantern in the dark, warm, gentle, and full of life. And just like that, the story that began with a single act of compassion had come full circle. What started with a simple choice, letting a homeless grandmother and her granddaughter stay for one night, had turned into a lifetime of love, friendship, and hope. Because sometimes, one small act of kindness doesn't just change someone else's life, it changes yours too.